All right, everyone. Thank you all for joining me today. Okay, we've got a lot of news to go over today. Quite a lot of development occurred over the weekend. And I want to talk about this. This is one of those podcasts that a lot of information we've got to cover in a very short period of time as it relates to what's going on in Africa. And I want to get to it. So here are the highlights that we're going to be discussing in this video. First, we're going to talk about the AES, the Alliance of Sahel States, who held their first ever summit on July 6th, which was on Saturday. We're going to talk about what was discussed in that summit and how significant that was for that region. And then we're going to talk about ECOWAS, who also had their own summit on Sunday, July 7th. We're going to discuss what ECOWAS talked about, how that is also significant, and how these two summits pose, depending on where you're looking at it, either a threat to the West African bloc or a stronger alliance. Okay, so we're going to discuss these two things. Thirdly, we're going to talk about IMF. Why, with these two things going on in the Sahel as well as with ECOWAS, we're going to talk about how the IMF and their debt trap may very well win again in this situation. I'm going to discuss that, and I'm going to break that down for you. And then lastly, I'm going to tell you why the Sahel state, the newly formed AES countries, are more likely to join BRICS based on their core values and their shared goal, are more likely to join BRICS than any of the other West African countries. Okay? So you see, there's a lot going on here. And like our elders would say, let's go inside because we have much to discuss. We've got a lot of news to discuss, and I want to really cover this in detail. But before we do, first things first, I want to give a shout out to Chef EDE1 for your $10 super chat on my last video. I truly, truly appreciate that. That was very, very encouraging. Thank you so much for your donation. I truly appreciate you, putting your money behind your support. So thank you very much for that. And also, guys, please keep the super chat coming. And as you do, I will definitely give you guys your kudos for it. So thank you again for it. Okay, let's get into this video. Now, first, let's talk about the AES, the Alliance of the Sahel States, which was formed in September of 2023. This was a direct response against ECOWAS. These are the Alliance of Sahel States was something that was formed by three countries who had coups over the last 3 years. Mali, who was the first to have a coup in 2001, followed by, Burkina Faso in 2002. And the last one that we saw was by Niger in 2003. These three countries have somehow found a connection with each other. Ever since that has occurred, they have strengthened the alliance. They have signed a defense pact. The summit that occurred recently was to discuss many things in terms of defense strategy, economic strategy. They're also proposing to have a bank that would help to improve the economic situation in their countries. And within that also, they also signed a treaty called the Confederation of the Sahel States, which Assimi Goitia was appointed president for 1 year in this. I want you to take a listen to a speech made by General Abdulhamid Chiani during the AES. I want you especially want to play this particular clip that he said regarding ECOWAS. ECOWAS is going to be a major conversation in this podcast. What he said about ECOWAS, how his people and their people have abandoned ECOWAS because according to them, ECOWAS has not lived up to all of the pledges that it made to all of its 15 members, which is to strengthen that whole block, to bring prosperity to that whole block. So take a listen to how he describes ECOWAS and what he says about ECOWAS, and I'll be right back.
Mr. President Goita and Traoré, the Alliance of Sahel States Confederation will therefore be built on a substrate that ensures the protection of populations against any threat of aggression, rebellion, armed banditry or any hostile act coming from outside.
Rébellion, banditisme armé ou tout acte hostile venant de l'extérieur.
I remain convinced that in the current geopolitical context, the Alliance of Sahel States constitutes the only efficient sub-regional grouping in the field of the fight against terrorism, ECOWAS having shone by its lack of involvement in this fight.
La CEDEAO ayant brillé par son déficit d'implication dans cette lutte. De ce fait,
as a result, the Alliance of Sahel States alone allows us to face terrorist threats as no other regional or international structure has done before.
Aucune autre structure régionale ou internationale ne l'a fait auparavant.
Dear fellow heads of state, while consolidating this strategic task, it is necessary in the current geopolitical context to coordinate our diplomatic actions, both bilaterally and within multilateral organizations, and harmonize our foreign policies to best guarantee the interests of our Alliance of Sahel States Confederation in the international arena.
Pour garantir au mieux les intérêts de notre confédération, Alliance États du Sahel dans l'arène internationale. D'ores et déjà,
significant diplomatic successes have already been recorded, as evidenced by the strong return of our states to the international stage, with the resumption of cooperation with bilateral and multilateral partners, as well as the conclusion of new strategic partnerships.
Ainsi que la conclusion de partenariats stratégiques nouveaux.
Concerning the development axis, it is urgent to create the conditions for genuine food security in the countries of the Alliance and to set up the economic, financial and monetary system necessary for financing development and productive investment in the space of the states of the Alliance.
Et monétaire nécessaire au financement du développement et à l'investissement productif dans l'espace des États de l'Alliance.
This is evidenced by the enthusiasm generated every day by the Alliance of the Sahel States among our youth and our women, because this popular momentum constitutes the best guarantee of building a confederation of people and not a bureaucratic edifice.
De construction d'une confédération de peuples et non un édifice bureaucratique. Chers collègues chefs,
dear fellow heads of state, our deliberations will certainly make it possible to adopt the legal and institutional framework to give substance and identity to the Alliance of Sahel States Confederation.
Identité à la Confédération Alliance des États du Sahel. Nos peuples
Our peoples have irrevocably turned their backs on ECOWAS.
à la CEDEAO. Il nous appartient
It is up to us today to create the confederation of the Alliance of the Sahel States.
Alliance des États du Sahel. Une alternative à
An alternative to any fictitious regional grouping, by building a sovereign community of peoples.
communauté souveraine des peuples. Une communauté éloignée
A community far from the control of foreign powers, a community of peace, solidarity, and prosperity based on our African values.
de prospérité basée sur nos valeurs africaines.
Okay, so that was very that's a very telling statement. Now, why are they forming? Why did the AES form? Okay, and more importantly, why did they recently sign during that whole summit the Confederation of the Sahel States? Now, one of the key things that you'll find with these three countries who have also submitted a proposal to break away from ECOWAS. Early in January, there was a proposal put forth that they want to secede from ECOWAS. They don't want to have anything to do with ECOWAS. If you followed my channel and you follow the story behind these three, you can kind of understand why. These three countries, one of the key things that really that was common with these three countries, Mali, Burkina Faso, as well as Niger, the reason why they had a coup to oust the sitting president that was in those countries, most recently was Mohamed Bazoum from Niger. The reason why is because one of the key things you'll find is that they did not like how their president was handling the terrorist situation in those countries, the defense situation, as well as economic problems the country were having. They also pushed back against France's involvement in this country. France, these are all Francophone countries. France has been looting these countries for years with their own president, the president they ousted, being a puppet to Europe, to France, and stealing their resources at the benefit of France without doing anything about the security situation. I talk about security. I want you to put a pin on that because the security aspect in West Africa is a major concern that we're going to talk about today. It's a huge thing, most especially because of Boko Haram, who has been gaining a lot of momentum over the since 2014 when they really made headlines. Boko Haram made headlines in 2014 when they captured over 200 women, or 200 girls, I should say, from Chibok in Nigeria. And they took these women, went to a school, ravaged the place, and captured all those women. It was a huge thing. There was hashtag Bring Back Our Girls that was circulating all the way from 2014, 2015, in an attempt to really have these girls rescued. Ever since that, Boko Haram has gained momentum. The leader of Boko Haram, who is a vicious animal, has been beheading people and causing a lot of mayhem. They have also since had a lot of suicide bombing. So it's been a problem in the Nigeria area, in Cameroon, in Chad, and also in these countries. These three countries have been seeing the president of Boko Haram. And so their gripe has been that their sitting president hasn't been doing anything about the insecurity, the rise of Islamic insurgencies in these countries. Not to mention that they've been watching their sitting president, the ones that were so-called democratically elected, be puppets to France and siphoning off their resources to France. So this is what caused a lot of the reason for the coup. Now, the AES summit was to address that particularly, to make sure that the three countries had a defense pact, which they understood that an attack against one is an attack against all. That sounds familiar, right? This type of stuff white people do, like the NATO alliance. You attack one, you attack all, that kind of stuff. They also talked about ramping up security to combat this, because this is an issue for countries that are dealing with this. Major issue. It kills investment to those countries, not to mention economic, it kills any economic growth. It also, not to mention the loss of lives that is as a result of these insurgencies, which is gaining a lot of momentum. And so when they formed the alliance of the Sahel states back in September of last year, it was to address that. Now they've formed the newly won, the Confederation of Sahel States, which are hoping to build upon that, and is under the umbrella of the AES. They talked about also having a bank, economic bank. Now, when I heard that excited me, but at the same time, it also got me nervous. Because if you've been watching the history of Africa, understanding leaders who have tried the same thing that they're trying to do, we all know what happened to those leaders. Muammar Gaddafi, his vision for Africa, to have a centralized banking system where Africa had its own currency. We know what happened with him. They took him out. We know what happened with other leaders too who dared that stuff. So I'm excited that these brothers are trying to establish a banking system that will be self-sufficient for their region. But at the same time, I'm also very cautious, and I'm also very on the lookout, because I know what that signifies to our enemies, those who don't want to see us progress, those who don't want to see us economically free, who want to bankrupt our continent by saddling us with debt. They also talked about free movement of their citizens within those three countries, which I think is a good thing, so they can trade. It's one of those barriers that ECOWAS has not been able to cross. has not been able to lift because the ECOWAS members, there isn't that a free flow of trade. You know, there's a lot of people in Africa that would say that, how is it that if I'm going from Nigeria to certain part of Africa, I need a visa, right? One of the sad things about Africa, right, is that I am more likely a person with a U.S. passport is able to go through all part of Africa than an African in Africa travel within the countries of Africa. That's a sad thing. It really is. Just imagine that you're on the continent, and if I want to go from Nigeria to Ghana or Ghana to Cameroon or South Africa, you can't have a free flow or free movement in Africa. So it's a problem. We're talking about West Africa right here, right? And so a lot of those 15 members have not been able to solve that issue. So these brothers are trying to solve that. And I think that that is the thinking in the right direction. I think that's a real thinking in the right direction. That summit they had, the agenda they covered, to me, is what you should be talking about, is what a summit should represent. You should go into a summit like that and come out of it with a strong agenda that would improve the livelihood of your citizens in your country as well as the region that you represent. So in my opinion, that was a very strong summit. Okay. So now let's talk about ECOWAS, who had their own summit the day after, on July 7th. ECOWAS, has 15 members, who these three countries are still members of ECOWAS yet, right? Even though they've submitted a proposal and a request to break away from that. They're still, based on the treaty they signed, all members signed. There's a year from the moment you submit your proposal to ECOWAS that has to go. You have to have a year waiting period for reevaluation. Okay, this is why Nigeria, who is the head of ECOWAS, the chairman of ECOWAS is Nigeria's president, Bola Ahmed Tinubu, told in early this year, when they sanctioned Niger for their coup against Mohamed Bazoum, they heavily sanctioned Niger. When they submitted their proposal to want to be out of that, Nigeria had to lower a lot of the sanctions against them. As a matter of fact, I covered this. I covered a lot of this during that time. I want you to take a listen to what I said in my video, my coverage early here, about 5 months ago when I talked about this, and how ECOWAS, the way ECOWAS is handling this whole thing, is really showing that it's on the wrong side of history with this, how it is handling the situation as it relates to Niger, and that Nigeria will need to lower or reduce or remove the sanctions against Niger because Nigerians and Nigerians are like brothers. And so I'm hoping that my video made it across somewhere, or somehow they were able to become reasonable and they lowered or removed some of the sanctions against Niger in an attempt to promote dialogue. Take a listen to what I said during that time and I'll be right back. I will tell you that the decision for Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger to now break away from ECOWAS is going to weaken West Africa and ECOWAS. It is not a good thing. ECOWAS, my suggestion with ECOWAS would be that ECOWAS will need to work fervently to ensure that these three countries don't break away. Because we are strong, united. We are much stronger together. And the 15 African countries that make up ECOWAS are much stronger when they band together. I would much prefer that Nigeria lowers or reduces the sanctions that is imposed on these countries. Much better to just lower its sanctions. I would rather that Nigeria does that than having to have these countries break away and go to Russia. Because what that does, it weakens the West African region. And it weakens the West African region to where others and other Europeans can now come in as vultures like they've always done to rip its resources much more than it is right now. Okay, so in an attempt for Nigeria and ECOWAS to promote dialogue with these countries who had said that they want to secede from ECOWAS, the sanctions against Niger was pulled down. Some of the sanctions still stay, so but they gave them back some of those. They reduced some of those sanctions, like cutting off their power supply and electricity and all of that. To me, that was ridiculous, but they lowered those sanctions. But nonetheless, these countries still want to leave, okay? And we'll discuss much further than that. ECOWAS meeting talked about these three countries. That was the main highlight in the summit. Because the reason why is what I also addressed in the video that I just played for you, is that if these three countries leave, it weakens the West African bloc. It really does. Especially with the fact that the West Africa is really dealing with the insurgency, which they've not been able to combat for the last since 2014, when Boko Haram has been gaining momentum. It is one of the reasons why these three countries are adamant about leaving ECOWAS, because they've not seen value with ECOWAS as it relates to defense and security protection. ECOWAS has not been able to do anything. I mean, these countries and members of ECOWAS are heavily dealing with Boko Haram, and they've not been able to solve that issue. Many are also saying that ECOWAS could very well be a puppet organization. Many are saying that ECOWAS is bought and sold. Many are saying that ECOWAS, is in the pocket of the West and Europe. Many are blaming ECOWAS for their inability to handle the security issues as it relates to Boko Haram. We'll talk about that also. So getting back to ECOWAS, the main highlight with ECOWAS was to discuss this, to discuss why it's important that these countries don't break away. And also, they're also proposing heavy to isolate these countries, especially Mali and Niger. Mali and Niger are perhaps going to suffer the brunt of ECOWAS isolation because these two countries are landlocked. They're landlocked countries. And so these two countries could very well have feel the effect of isolation. So what ECOWAS is probably trying to do is do what the West does, right? Which is isolate anyone they've sanctioned so that they don't do business with other people. That type of tactics, right? So because I don't want to do business with you and I don't like what you're doing, I'm going to stifle your growth so you can't deal with any other West African bloc, which is why a lot of people are saying ECOWAS could very well be a Western puppet organization. You can kind of see where they're getting that from. Okay, so that was the discussion. Now, here's the problem that ECOWAS also has, in addition, which is part of that whole security thing. ECOWAS needs $2.6 billion a year to combat the insurgencies, the Islamic insurgencies that's gaining momentum in that area. They need money. They don't have it. So ECOWAS needs $2.6 billion annually to establish a 5,000 strong security force to combat this. Now, when I heard that, the first thing that came to mind is, did you just wake up? Did you just wake up to realize that you need to raise that type of force to combat this insurgencies that's been a problem, like I said, since 2014? Do you understand this? And I think that the reason why ECOWAS is trying to now do something, or at least appearing to do something, is because they're realizing that they're about to lose 3 of its members, which could be a problem for an already weakened or weak bloc. So ECOWAS needs to raise the money, $2.6 billion annually. Annually. Now, when you look at the 15 members that make up ECOWAS, these countries are struggling economically. Where are they going to get the money from? How are they going to do it? Nigeria has an inflation of 30%. Ghana has an inflation of 40%. Many of the countries that make up ECOWAS are struggling economically. They've not been able to recover from the COVID situation. Their currencies are devaluing every single day. How are they going to raise the money? So during that meeting, ECOWAS talked about how these other members who are trying to leave are still part of ECOWAS, and so they are still obligated financially to contribute to this. Now, let me ask you a question. Hearing what I just said, regarding why the AES was formed and why these three countries are thinking about leaving, and hearing their reason behind why they had a coup in their country, which is primarily because of France. It's an indictment against France, and these countries have demonstrated they don't want to have anything to do with Europe, France, or whatsoever. Knowing fully well that ECOWAS, from what people are saying, and for the public perception about ECOWAS, is ECOWAS a puppet to West. So there's obviously a clash of values here. What are the likelihood? Here's the question. What are the likelihood that you think that these countries are going to cough up any portion of their obligation financially to this so-called $2.6 billion that ECOWAS talked about raising annually to combat this security insurgencies that they've not been able to fight for the last decade? Think about it for a second. Do you really see that happening? Do you really see any of the presidents for these three countries coughing up money to ECOWAS? So there's a problem with that. So there's a huge issue with that. However, they're still obligated to the treaty they signed when they joined ECOWAS. So that's, on a legal standpoint, that is something that will let the legality of that take place, right? Now, here's what I really want to focus on. So we know that there's a money issue. ECOWAS needs to raise money. We know that there's a problem. They got to combat this crazy terrorist group called Boko Haram that's been terrorizing everyone in West Africa and is growing larger. We know that these countries in this region have an issue. They have a huge issue regarding that, and they need money. Now, I've just said that these countries are heavily economically bankrupt. Heavily. Ghana declared bankruptcy last year. Many of the countries in ECOWAS are financially strapped. So the likelihood of that money raised is probably little to none. And here's where IMF comes in. This is why I said IMF, debt trap, could very well win again. Let me talk about what the debt trap is. IMF, which works for the United States, which is basically a buddy-buddy system that the United States created, was primarily created to offer loans to developing countries. The strategy behind that has been for years to indebt and enslave developing countries, Africa being one of those, right? It's not just that you have countries in South America, you have countries in Asia, you have countries in Africa. There are countries that IMF target. They specifically target countries with resources. The strategy that IMF uses is to go to developing countries and offer to help with their infrastructure, help with to provide them money to do things that they can't generate from the private sector. In exchange, if they default, right? The terms of the loan is if you default, now we can come in and take your minerals at pennies on the dollars. We can have our corporations, McDonald's, Burger King, IBM, Caterpillar, whatever the company is, to now have access. That's usually what the term of the loan is. These loans are mostly predatory. They're predatory lending. That is more like the outcome for those loans are towards you defaulted. There's a huge likelihood that you're going to default. They know what they're doing. So they offer you a temporary solution. Many African countries are indebted to IMF. So I think ECOWAS, with the perception that people have that they're in bed with the West, is likely going to go to the West and IMF for the $2.6 billion that it needs to combat. What do you think the IMF is going to require and ask in return for that loan that it will borrow for that particular objective? You guessed it. You understand this? Okay. Now, here's the that's the sad part about this whole thing. Now, on the thumbnail of this video, I said that these three men from Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger are very well the men that have saved and could save Africa from the drowning debt and the financial enslavement that Africa finds itself right now. What do I mean by that? What I mean by that is that because These countries are going up against the one thing that has been causing Africa's demise financially, economically over the last few years, which is fighting against Europe and the West. They're joining themselves with another European country as well as Asia. They're trying to, gain a new partnership with the likes of Russia. Now, what do you think the strategy is? If I were General Abdulhamid Shiani, or if I was Ibrahim Traoré, or if I was Assimi Goïta, if I were any one of these guys, knowing fully well that ECOWAS is a large organization, and we're breaking out of that. We need something to protect us against retaliation from ECOWAS and against any retaliation from this other mammoth, the West and Europe. What do you think that strategy is? If I were any one of these things, I think that they're probably having conversation to join BRICS. I think it will make more sense. Think about it for a second, especially with their relationship, newly formed relationship with Russia. I think these three, it will make sense for one of these three countries to become the next member of BRICS. I think Putin, right? Russia, Vladimir Putin is going to use this as an advantage to him, especially since he's been able to prove that his country did not fall apart, even though with all the sanctions. I think he's going to teach these countries how to weather the so-called sanctions from ECOWAS or the West, because he has done it. I think they will find in him a more suitable ally than what they've had with either ECOWAS and ECOWAS having allies with the West and Europe. I think these guys are in a better position, because what these guys are not going to do is go get money from the IMF. It goes against everything that they stand for. So maybe Russia can help them. Maybe Russia provides them with finances and defense contracting and all of that. Maybe Russia does. I don't know. Maybe Russia helps them through their insecurity situation. I guess what else they're going to learn from Russia is how to combat these so-called international or Western or European. So they might find Russia to be a better ally. Why do you think that they are so defiant against ECOWAS? Why do you think that? I guarantee you these men are smart. Now, when I said this man could very well have saved Africa, is that Africa right now, with a lot of the countries are indebted. Look at what's going on in Kenya. The insurgent, the rioting and revolt that we saw in Kenya is something that could very well likely happen in many other African countries, because a lot of African countries are saddened with debt. And they're about to even be more debt that's going to happen. And so what happens to Africans and their citizens when you have such debt bogged you down, you lose your resources, you lose your land. So the only countries that could very well have their land safe are perhaps these three countries that kicked these people out of their land. Do you see what's going on here? You see why I said these three countries could very well have saved Africa? Because what's going to happen with citizens watching what's going on? What's going to happen with citizens who are strapped in their countries? And they look across and they're seeing Burkina Faso, Mali excelling at some point. And they're seeing their countries deteriorate. What do you think is going to happen? I can't speak of it, nor do I want to. So I think a lot of people are going to watch these three countries, as these three countries are going to become a model for a lot of African countries who are probably going to see and say, hey, hold on a second. How are these countries able to do these things? And you guys aren't. And they're going to begin demanding of their countries things that a lot of these African leaders have never experienced, like what we saw in Kenya. So African leaders are about to have a different type of experience in Africa. One, they're not about to just keep doing the same old, and think their citizens are going to just take it anymore. So they know they've got work to do. And they know they have to do something quickly. One of which is they got to take care of this insurgency in Boko Haram, which is a huge problem. And the United States knows this. United States knows that Africa has this problem in its hand because, and I will say this and I'll close. If I were the United States, right, I'm happy Africa has a Boko Haram problem because it plays into my hands. See, the United States, with this Boko Haram situation, if U.S. wanted to neutralize the head of Boko Haram, the United States has the capability of neutralizing it. I guarantee you they do. I guarantee the U.S. with all the intelligence, I guarantee the U.S. knows where he's at. I mean, U.S. took out bin Laden, the head of Al Qaeda, during the Obama administration. Why? Because the U.S. had an interest in it. They came and attacked us on 9/11. That was a no-no, right? That was a no-no. And so they worked their butt off to make sure that he was never going to get away. And they finally got him and took him out. You think they don't know where the leader of Boko Haram is? They know, but it's not their problem. They can use that to their advantage because they know that it's an issue for Africa. And they know that Africa is going to come to them for help. And so they can just allow that whole thing play out. So Africa goes to them, which is what Africa is going to do, is have these countries go to them for help in terms of financial help and assistance. And that's going to reinforce the position of the United States as it relates to the resources that Africa has and indebt Africa much more and enslave its citizens. This is not good. So these three countries could very well be the savior of Africa as the way it looks right now, because they're the only ones that dared and had the bravery to break away from the rat race. They're the only ones that had the audacity to break away from the rat race. But of course, ECOWAS is probably going to be used to try to bully them, right? But these three countries, I think they're so defiant, they're so adamant, and I don't think ECOWAS is going to be able to convince these three brothers to stay. And these brothers have already made up their mind to move the other way. And that could very well be a saving grace for Africa and what's to come to Africa. But anyway, tell me what your thoughts are. What do you think about my analysis? I've given you a lot of information today, a lot of information for you to consider. What are your thoughts on it? Please leave it in the comment section because I'll be interested to learn from you all. If you think my analysis is accurate, if you see what I've seen, and if you understand where this is going, and agree with me ultimately that these three countries could very well be the saving grace for Africa and the pride of Africa in the long run. Anyway, thank you all for watching. Please like the video, share the content, subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you all next time. Bye-bye.
Kommer aldrig känna så här för någon annan än dig. Aldrig, aldrig, aldrig. Kommer aldrig känna så här för någon annan än dig. Varje gång jag bak på dig, jag tänker åh vilket kap jag har gjort. Jag skulle gå tillbaks i tid, göra om allt igen och förstå.